All right, everyone. So I'd like to welcome you to the first Dean's Digital Cafe of spring 2024. As most of you know, I'm Professor William Letsou in the Biological and Chemical Sciences Department, and on behalf of Dean Quigley, I'm happy to see you all. Welcome you all here. And as I just mentioned, we are recording this meeting, and you can access the recording of this meeting and other past meetings we've had by enrolling in our Canvas course at the link I've just now posted in the chat. Right? Okay. So feel free to answer to post questions in the chat at any time during the talk. And we'll at the end, of course, we'll have some open Q&A, I hope, if we have time for. And now before we get started, I'd like to acknowledge the land. So the Long Island campus of New York Tech sits on a larger territory known as Pominoke, which was home to numerous indigenous communities, including the local tribes of the Mattincocks and the Merricks. I'd like to acknowledge the land, the stewardship, and sovereignty of the native peoples and their enduring importance, even in this virtual environment here today. So, I'm okay. Well, I'm the host of today's event and all other future events this term, and I'm also your speaker. So today, I'll just give a little bit of background about me. I joined New York Tech in the fall of 2022, so I've not been here much longer than most of you. And before coming to New York Tech, I was at St. Jude Children's Research Hospital in Memphis, Tennessee, where I learned a lot about being a cancer epidemiologist. I've become more of here in New York Tech, I'm continuing doing some computational biology research, and I hope after today's talk, you kind of see why that connection makes sense. Okay. Luba, do we have anything else before we start?
No, we can just start it.
Okay, and I'll begin. So let me share my screen and I will get started. Chrome, I think. Share. Do we see full screen mode or presenter mode? Good.
Looks good.
Okay, thank you. So today's talk is called How Video Gamers Will Cure Cancer. So when Dean Quigley, first asked me to give this talk, and I told him that I'd be giving a boring talk about my research, I felt that I really just had let him down. So I thought back to Professor Hofstrand's great talk last year about music and math. And I asked myself, okay, what's something I'm good at and I know a lot about that I can tell you all about? And after I thought about it for a few minutes and I came up with nothing, I decided I'd tell you about video games. So today's talk, I'm going to be telling you about how video games will cure cancer. And I'd like to say how some themes from video games can maybe change your attitude about science and how to enjoy it more and to make the process more fun and more profitable. Okay. So what really got me inspired to give this talk was an article I read more than 13 years ago now, like in 2010, from the New York Times about this article in the science section about why video gamers keep playing, what it is about video games that really draws them in. And I was really moved by this quote. By one estimate, Dr. McGonigal notes, who was being interviewed, creating Wikipedia took 8 years and over 100 million hours of work. But that's only half the number of hours spent in a single week by people playing World of Warcraft. So that's a lot of time. And how can we put that time to good use? How can we harness this energy of people willing to do repetitive tasks, spend countless hours on them, and turn it into science or into useful work? So that was really the question that motivated me, because we all know that video games are addictive, and we want to spend time in those worlds. What is it about them that draws us in? And what is it that commute? Excuse me. Okay. What is it that keeps us? Are we okay? All right. What is it that keeps us playing? All right. So in today's talk, I'm going to be focusing on three things. First, I'd like to talk a little about the psychology of gaming. What is it, the things that keep people playing, and why and some of the benefits that derive from it as well. I'd also like to talk a little bit about how gaming has been applied and how gaming has been actually used in research, particularly in the field of AI, and also more recently in cancer research. And then finally, I'd like to think about how the themes from video games really apply to being a more effective scientist. So while in the first two talks, first two parts of the talk, we can think about maybe how video games are directly influencing you. I want to maybe extend this a little more and say how you can, just make science more fun and more enjoyable, and again, more profitable. Okay. So psychological research and the effects on and the appeal and benefits of video games. So where do we start? So before I get too far into it, I'd like to note that I'm not that much older than you all, but a little bit. So some of my knowledge of video games might be a little outdated. So I really can't answer many questions about esports or things like Fortnite or that. I kind of remember video games back when GameStop was a store and not a stock. But that aside, I think some of the same principles apply to video games now. So this chart I liked from a paper in 2013, I believe, and it was a very popular paper just about the different video games and how they can be good for you and why people keep playing them. And I like this graph they made of the hierarchy of video, or the space of video games, if you will. They classified them into games social or non-social, and also complex or not complex, or simple, as we would say. So up here in the top left, you see maybe your what we call your hardcore games, right, for solo players, and your RPGs, things like for people who play Final Fantasy or Halo or Aussie or Devil May Cry. This is a little bit outdated, about 10 years ago, but some of these are still very popular. And of course, we have over here your more online games, things like World of Warcraft, or now I guess it'd be Fortnite, but other things you play online. I was never too much into this category. I was more on the top left over here. But down at the bottom, we also have phone games, things like puzzle games, things that you can play quickly and things that you can play quickly and without much time investment. And I think and you should notice from the plot, most of these phone games aren't there yet, because this was quite when things were just starting to happen on phones. And I think phones really changed how people play video games, because for one, I remember being on a plane and seeing a middle-aged woman playing Angry Birds on her phone. And I thought, that was probably that demographic was probably a very small part of a company like Nintendo's market share. They were probably aimed at children, probably more at males. But here it was, because things were on a phone, they were suddenly more accessible to lots of people, many more people. And another important aspect about phone games is that they really lowered the barrier to entry. In the old days, you could play puzzle games on a handheld. You could play things like a crossword puzzle or word searches, those very simple games. But to use them on a handheld, you'd had to turn on the system, wait for it to load, and just really put in the time commitment to playing. With a phone, you can play something for a few seconds, put it down, but your phone's always on. You don't need to go to Costco and buy another 64 pack of AA's. You can keep playing. Oops. And so that's just all to say that, there's lots of video games out there, lots of different kinds. And I like this other quote as well, that one can no more say what the effects of video games are than one can say what the effects of food are, right? So there's so many different things. And if we can't just make any blanket statements about whether video games are good or bad or whatever. We have to maybe look more specifically at the different games. Okay. And again, this was just why do people play these games? So there's a lot of research actually. I was surprised at how much on why people play games or just the psychology of games in general. And the things that pop up are it's fun, it's exciting. It's the joy of competing and trying to challenge and to figure things out. And what I struck me is that even though video games are something of a chore, right? You have to do a lot of kind of repetitive tasks in order to get ahead, and a lot of them aren't too easy. But people, for some reason, want to do this. They elect to do this over other things. What is it about it? And you notice there's also some, like the things that are controversial about video games, particularly things like violence and weapons, are relatively minor reason people like to play. I mean, some people express frustration and saying to like to see all the explosions and things, but it's primarily that they're getting some sort of enjoyment out of it, not that they're sadistic and trying to act out their macabre fantasies. So I think that says a lot about that we have to look more closely about why why people might think that games are bad for you, and maybe focus on some of the positives and how they can eventually help us and help science as well. Okay, so video games have been studied for a long time actually, and one of the primary reasons people seem to be drawn to them are these ideas of autonomy and competence. So when you play a video game, you're doing something much different than when you're watching TV or watching a movie. You're really choosing the experience. You're electing what you want to do. In adventure games, you can choose to solve puzzles and level up, which is a very, like achievement task, and you're satisfying that need to just feel like you're improving. But you can also, go be part of the story, do part of the role-playing experience and see how the characters interact and evolve. And that's this autonomy that you can choose what kind of emotional state you want to be in. And the other part of this is competence, where you should feel like you're getting better as you play the game, right? And the more you learn, you start out slow and you learn the controls, but you get better and the challenges increase proportionately. And so a lot of this research on video games, like that you can see at the bottom here, is really it boils down to the same thing. People they give games to some people and they give them a survey and they say, what do you feel about yourself? What do you feel about the game? What kind of behaviors do you do afterwards? It's really, they can get at some kind of interesting concepts just by giving people surveys. And one thing they found was, the video games, especially good ones, are mentally draining, maybe not so much physically, but you're left feeling like you've done something hard, especially if it's a good game in particular. But having done that relatively hard thing, you're left in a state of somewhat positive affect. You feel good about yourself, so it's like you've done something worth celebrating. So this kind of psychological state is really one of the primary appeals, I think, of games. This other paper looked at, just online games in general, but more of a not specifically to, role-playing games or console games, but just games that people play with each other online. But I think some of the same concepts are in play. Things like you play for achievements, you play to socialize, to meet other people online. And primarily, this last one, which we'll get into in a minute, is immersion, how much you feel like you are part of the game world. So this was again, there's very scientific, statistically sound research done on video games. And one thing which we probably won't talk about in our biostatistics classes, but which is a very useful tool, is to kind of break down the variance of the responses into different categories called either principal components or factor analysis. And what this study looked at was, basically, and again, a survey of people and asking them why they play these video games. And they really broke it down into those three categories I mentioned: achievement, socialization, and immersion. So we've kind of talked about the first two, where you feel like you're getting better at something, and you just like that feeling of advancement, showing people online what kind of how high your level is. But then there's also the socialization part, where you talk to people, meet new friends. And what was important about this study of the different categories was that these different categories are independent. You could play a game for achievement only, or you could play for socialization only, or both, right? So they didn't really correlate with each other. Um, but the last category I really like, and I think it applies to beyond just online games, is this idea of immersion, where you feel like you're part of the game world. And that can happen in other ways. You discover things, you find secrets, or you have there's a very compelling storyline, or just to, like, you feel you're playing this game and the rest of the world doesn't matter. It's okay. Things are okay when you're playing the game. Now, immersion is, I think really is the key piece here. And I think, Nintendo Link, everyone who the very recognizable video game character, his name is embodying that concept. So Link, there's a few different reasons why people think he's named Link. Some people say it's because he's left-handed, and Link apparently means left in German. But the real thing is that he links people together. He connects people. Everyone feels like some connection to Link. Um, because he's also the link between you and the game, right? He's the one you get to name him, and he's you, right? Link is famously a silent character, so even if the other characters are talking to him in the game, he doesn't speak because it's you who are speaking. You are the one who's responsible. Now, most of Link Zelda games are not too um, they're relatively linear, so you don't have too many actual choices to make. But the idea is that you are becoming the character. You're part of the game, and a lot of RPGs really use this mechanism where the main character is completely silent. Yes, and you have to, be the voice, be the person behind it. And this concept of identity has actually been, studied. So in this group, there were a few different ways of looking at this, but they were able to give people surveys and ask them, did you feel compelled to play this game? Did you feel, did you like it? Did you feel motivated? Were you immersed in it? Did you feel that you were acting out or becoming someone you wanted to be while playing this game? This idea of convergence was a very, convergence, they called it. So people have a few different conceptions of themselves. They have their conception of themselves as who they are in reality, who they'd like to be, what's called their ideal self. And then a game lets you kind of act out different identities. You can play as anyone, and that's your game self. So they figured at we're really investigating in this study whether the closer you are between your game self and your ideal self, whether by playing the game you feel like you're getting closer together to someone you want to be, then you would feel more immersed in the game, or feel more likely to play. So that's just what this arrow is sort of indicating, kind of schematically, of that what they find, that the more you identified like with the character, with the story, the more you were likely to be motivated to play the game. And this, this effect was stronger, of course, than people who were highly immersed in the game, who really felt they were able to shut out the outside world. So the more you connect with the character, the more you're motivated to play. Another kind of maybe problematic, but still nevertheless interesting, is that people might use games to if they feel not very positively about themselves to begin with. So they want to be someone different than who they are. And these people, illustrated by this dashed line, were more likely to report, being motivated by the game. If the character really jived with them, they were able to be more motivated to play. So maybe these people who had a lower, maybe lower self-confidence, lower self-esteem, are more drawn to video games. So maybe that could be good or bad if we're, feeding into, people's, shyness in a way. And maybe video games are like a way to hide themselves from the world. But maybe at the other hand, maybe it's therapeutic. Maybe if by experiencing this convergence between who you want to be, who you want to be, and who the game is having you be, you'll be more self-confident in the real world. Okay, so there's other kinds of studies people do. They look at people under the MRI. They look at your brain and see what parts of your brain are lighting up when you play video games. Now, these kind of brain studies are hard to interpret. Even one of my professors at St. Jude made this point that when the brain lights up, we don't really know what it means, right? Sometimes if your brain is lighting up when you're playing a video game, it means you're activating that region. But sometimes it doesn't light up, and people can interpret that as, well, you're just more efficient. So there's a problematic interpretation of these of some of these studies, and the authors and of this study noticed that as well. But again, what they find was a small but significant effect of video games on people's reaction times and their correctness. So they gave these people in the fMRI a bunch of different tasks, kind of again, video game tasks basically. And they were looking at your RT, your reaction time, and they found that people who played the video games had a slightly lower reaction time, so they were quicker. And they noted this is a very small difference, but it was, as we'll talked about in a later chapter, they were statistically significant, and they also got some more of the questions correct. But again, just like I was mentioning a couple slides ago, that maybe the people who are playing these games are doing them because they have some maybe low self-esteem or low convergence with their ideal self. But they noticed that the people who played games, had some increased scores on some of these psychological traits, these kind of negative traits. None of them approached this blue line, which was clinically relevant. But there was a difference between the video gamers and the non-video gamers. And, we should be very careful about what the cause of that was, whether the video gamers were seeking out video games to deal with their problems, or whether the video games were causing their problems. This is a very thorny issue. But what specifically can the video games do for you? So these particularly, again, which kinds of video games are good for you or not good for you? And again, looking at these brain imaging studies, these people were reviewing the idea that when you play shooting games, action games, first-person shooters, you're more focused, and that you have less activation of these other regions. And again, this is the interpretation issue I brought up, but you have lower noise. You're more focused on the goal when you play action video games. And how could they measure this? And what could it show? How could it be, quantified? So they gave people this task called a mental rotation task. So if you've taken organic chemistry, you'll appreciate this. But the idea was to show people a shape and say, okay, which shapes of these four are equivalent? If you do play the game, you can try to see that these two should be the answers. It's what I hope they're right. I think that's what I got. But what they noticed was that they could train people on video games and see how they improve. So see the number of score, how their performance on this task, this mental rotation task, improved after a training session of video games, which in their paper they mentioned was about like 10 hours of video game training over a few weeks. And they noticed that before and after the training, people got more points correct. The effect was increased, a bigger difference in the females than the males. And it persisted over time, so that if they trained 5 months ago, they were still good today. But it was even more surprising what this was limited to the shooting games, right? The games that you think are bad for you. But in fact, a non-action game didn't improve this skill. So the idea that, having to pick out things in the environment quickly is actually, improving something. So, playing a game like this might help you next year when you have to do problems like this. Okay. So what is it that keeps us playing? So there's a psychological theory called flow, meaning that what is it about some task that keeps you doing it, that makes you want to ignore everything else and only focus on the task that you're seeing. And it kind of goes with this diagram captures it pretty well. That the more your skills improve at something, so the more you learn how to do something, the difficulty, the challenges that you face should scale proportionately. And so that means you're always in what's called this flow channel, where you're neither bored nor anxious. Okay, so this is concept of flow is old concept in psychology, but very seems to explain a lot of things. And it explains, why we engage in certain tasks, why we continue to play. So why we persist. So for example, in The Legend of Zelda, often face this frustration, but you persist. Um, you run into likes that eat your shield and you have to leave and go get another one, or this kind of thing maybe disrupts the flow a little bit because it takes you out of the game. It makes you frustrated. Um, some other examples of frustration are are this game, older game called Diddy Kong Racing, which I got when I was, I think, 7, and I don't think I beat until about 10 years later. And what really struck me about this was a quote from someone who had played this game and was very frustrated with it, and that this pig who you have to race and beat cheats. He takes off the starting line before you, and even if you overtake him, he'll still win. So you have to play perfectly. And he said it's maddening. I spent almost a week trying to beat him. My hands were so sore every time from trying, and I eventually did it, but I don't think I'd ever have the patience to do it again. And even though it was frustrating, he wanted to keep playing, and I think a lot of people who play video games know that feeling. You have that it needs to be done. You have to persist, even if it's frustrating. Um, and so this idea that people persist because they play video games was tested in this paper where they gave people anagrams. Um, and they said to try to unscramble these words. So this was a tough one. I'm giving you some of the tough ones. This one, if you try on your own for a second, but it comes out to digami, which I actually, when I first saw it, I thought that was the mixed up word. Um, this one, I'll give you 5 seconds, and then actually gimlet, and then finally this one, which I thought was really hard. I didn't get it either, but it becomes belie. Um, and what they weren't testing was whether how good you are at unscrambling anagrams, but what they were testing was how much you persist at them. And they found that the time people spent on the unsolved anagrams, they only had a little bit of time to get it right, but the time they spent on the unsolved anagrams was higher among those who played video games. So they were persisting. So really what's important here is that genius is highly overrated. It's not that you're smarter than people. It's that you're willing to spend a little more time on things than they are, that you want to see it through to the end. Okay. And another very important piece of video games is that they seem to instill this idea of cognitive flexibility. So we see that in games like Final Fantasy 12, where you've just beaten a hard boss and you have all kinds of nasty side effects and your healer is low on HP and MP, and you want to save your game and get recovered, but it turns out to be a monster in a trap. So you have to adapt to these situations that you haven't learned before. Another one, I like this paper a lot. They discuss what makes video games fun and what crosses the border into bad design. And one of the points they made was that you shouldn't make things shouldn't make things that look like death actually be a pathway to success. So you shouldn't have to jump down a hole when that's usually bad, when that usually kills you. And my favorite example was from Wario Land, where in most games your idea is to go through that door and start collecting coins and beating enemies. But what the genius of this game was, if you just sit there and if you just put the controller down and wait 5 seconds, the pirates will come and kidnap Wario, and you'll beat the level, and you'll get to access a whole nother set of levels. So that you do something unexpected. You're asked to unlearn some things that you've already learned and try new things. Okay. And they were able to test this concept as well, this idea of cognitive flexibility. So it was a little bit tricky, a little bit convoluted what they're doing. This is again one of those psychology tests where they put you in front of a screen and ask you to do all kinds of crazy things. They were prompting you to identify a shape. So they tell it, but there was a catch. You either had to identify what the shape was made of, whether this shape it shows you is made of squares or rectangles, or you had to identify the shape itself, whether it was a square or a rectangle. So it's a little confusing, but they're saying that you have a local cue, what's it made of, or a global cue, what is its actual shape. And they found that they switch these tasks. They say you get a cue, tell me what the shape is made of. Wait a minute, get a different cue, tell me what the big shape is. It's a rectangle. And they found out, that if you did this repeatedly, people got better. They were able to recognize correctly what the shape was. They practiced, they got better. But if you alternate the task, you switch between different modalities. And they found that the people who had played video games were faster at it than the people who hadn't, so that there was some benefit going on. Okay, and we can't have a talk about video games without, talking a little bit about the connection between video games and violence or aggression. So this is a very hot topic. And what this paper was called a meta-analysis. They looked at lots of different studies that were purporting to measure whether people were more aggressive, whether they used aggressive words or got into trouble at school more often after they had played video games. And so this is a useful technique in statistics to say, we don't just look at one study, but try to look at them all together, see if they're all giving the same picture of reality. And this beta, we'll talk about it later in the class, is a measurement of the effect size. So bigger beta, bigger positive beta means a bigger association between the variable we're interested in this case, video games, and the outcome, which was violence or just aggressive behavior. And they're concluding that yes, there was an association. At the same time, there's people who think this is all a bunch of nonsense. This is a bunch of this author Ferguson has a lot to say about this concept that these aren't very good, that these are bad studies. He says this is he said, look, I mean, if you even look at some of these titles, Blazing Angels or Resident Evil, and they be a force for good, or do Angry Birds make for angry children, or publication bias and why a beta rules in metas. So his point basically is that you can do as many studies as you want, but if they're not good studies, then even if you merge them all together, they're still not a good study. But so there's a lot of squabbles that happen in academia like this one, and basically it boils down to the problem of the same reasons. It boils down to the problem of a bias. You don't know whether the people who turn out to be violent or who turn out to be good were predisposed that way. Did the video games really have any effect on them? It's the same problem people had when figuring out whether cigarettes caused cancer. We couldn't really give people cigarettes and wait for several years we couldn't give them cigarettes and wait and not cigarettes and see if they develop cancer. That's one, unethical, and two, time consuming. The same could be said about video games. We can't randomize children to play video games or go to soccer camp instead. That would take way too much time to see if there was an effect of the video games. So these kind of studies are always going to be convoluted, and there's always going to be disagreements. But what I'd like to, I saw this article, and I thought this wasn't a very scientific article, but I think it just really hammered home the point to me that video games are pretend. And to train people to fire a virtual gun and to train to fire a real gun are very, very different things. And I think you could even counter nowadays that while video games are so much more realistic, it's not even use a controller anymore. But I think you would probably prove me wrong, but I don't think many people would play a video game with a realistic game where they had a chance of actually getting hurt. So I think there's still this barrier between reality and pretend that people are knowingly stepping across. They want to be on the pretend side of that line when they play video games. And also, video games, as we said at the beginning, there's many different kinds. They have different different themes, different different environments, and they have different stories. So, for example, this was a very mysterious called the Metal Gear Solid series, which is about nuclear war. And you would think a game like this would be very violent, inducing people to do violent things. You get weapons and bombs, all kinds of things. But in fact, it's actually, people think that this game is actually standing up against nuclear war. It's having a negative effect on it. It's saying that look at the terrors that come with it. And when one famous scene in it, you actually get the opportunity to, or maybe not opportunity is not the right word, you're punished to face off all the enemies you had killed and see all the gruesome things you did to them, to really paint out to really show that what you're doing is maybe bad. And in Metal Gear Solid, one of the mechanisms is that you're ranked at the very end on how many enemies you didn't kill. It's very twisted, twisted in a good way. And finally, I need to show this clip. If we can't talk that if video games have a lot to say, and they can touch you very emotionally. So a lot of people were very, very sad when Eris died, and me too. And as you see, other people were as well. And I just want to make the point that video games can have a lot of you know, they don't make you insensitive, and they make you, sensitive, I think. Anyway, sorry. I'd like to change gears a little bit. I hope we don't go a little too far over, but I'd like to maybe to talk about how video games are now actually being used in AI research and cancer research today. So you may all know this story of the computer called Deep Blue that famously defeated world chess champion Garry Kasparov in 1996. Um, and it was this giant computer that now exists on your phone. And for those of you who, like me, who aren't very good at chess and who lose to both people and computers, the idea that a computer could beat you was maybe not very surprising. But this idea that a computer could play chess goes back to the 1950s, where people were thinking about just starting to think about computer science and its implications. Could a computer play chess? And more recently, computers have learned to play a more complicated game called Go. I have no idea how to play Go, but it's a bigger game. You see that they're bigger, the board is bigger, and there's more possible moves. And famously defeated the Chinese champion in 2017. And even the Korean champion, I believe, faced off against Google's AlphaGo and beat it once, but he had declared he said at the end of it, I'm finished. This computer is better. Even if I beat it once, it was a fluke. And the reason, but how do computers do this? So if you know anything about game theory, which I don't know too much about game theory, so I'm not gonna pretend to, but the idea of the size of the game can help you predict how much computing power you would need to analyze the game. So in game theory, there's a concept called backward induction, where you find the winning combination, you find the outcome that you most like, and you work backwards from there. So if a computer can kind of store the whole game in its memory, it's easy. It just picks out what's the best thing to do here and done. But this scaling, the number of moves to the number of turns, is very large. And so games like Go and chess really can't, exhaustively search the whole space. So this is where something called deep neural networks come into play. They're very complicated. They involve a lot of steps, but they basically trained a computer to recognize what a human player would do, which we call this the policies. It learns different policies, and then it learns to associate values with those policies so that you prompt the computer with a state of the game, and then it produces what's the best move to do from that state. And it moves more beyond just board games. Because learning a board game, it's one game. It can master, and you can say, well, and you can just train it to do that one game and done. But give it another game, it's clueless. So this is what this Deep Q networks, also part of Google's DeepMind initiative, was trained to play different games. These 49 Atari games on the Atari 2600. And here's a clip of it, of this game of this Deep DQN playing Space Invaders. I think here we go. Yes, and this is a computer playing it. I'm a little too young for Space Invaders, but some people might remember it. But this is the This isn't the computer playing. This is Google playing. They don't. This is not the AI of the game. This is a computer actually, playing, given the controller, and is doing it. And he's just doing it very well. The score on the left is its score, and a score on the right, I think, is the enemy score, and it's winning and all it's doing, I'll show you what next, is learning to associate screens on the game with a certain button press. So these reinforcement learning, this idea of neural networks is rather complicated, but it's really just a amalgamation of some smaller parts. What these networks do is try to recognize patterns with these things called the convolutional layers of the network. So they see a pattern and learn how to extract that pattern, and then it learns to associate a pattern with a certain move on the joypad. And when they plot all those things out, all those states out on it looks like a brain, looks like a human brain. They find that the states that look similar, the empty screens and the full screens, look similar. And these kind of mystery screens also cluster together. And then it learns to associate a screen outcome with a move. And I said it looks a lot like your own brain. Okay, and it's not all fun and games. People use AI for things like protein folding, protein structure prediction. This is a very big initiative, also part of DeepMind, where you're given a sequence of a protein, what's the shape? And this avoids all the messy experiments of crystallization. Probably some people don't like that the crystallographers probably don't like being put out of business, but the computer does just as well. But I still think there's some things the computer is not quite good at. And that's something, I don't know if this is anyone, probably someone's working on this, but I don't know how well a computer is at putting a jigsaw puzzle together. Because in a jigsaw puzzle, you have a problem of combinatorial complexity, combinatorial explosion, because there's so many different pieces and so many places they could go. And that's sort of a concept that I've seen in my research with this combinatorial nature of biology, where there's so many factors and we look at them one by one, but we have to think about how they're all working together. So this is a picture of a paper my advisor and I published last summer about how if we look for different points in the genome that are varying, called SNPs. And we don't just look at one SNP, we look at the pattern of SNPs. And the problem is that there's a lot of patterns of SNPs, and we have millions, if not billions of them. And we were able to, and our goal was to to make another algorithm that identified these patterns, not by deep learning, but by extracting the patterns that were just observed in the data. So there's a lot more to that. You can follow up if you're interested, or talk to me about it offline. But, I think this idea that we can tackle combinatorial problems, not just by throwing all the computers at them, but by thinking about the problem a little more deeply has been used before. So if you're familiar from math, the determinant of a matrix is actually very difficult to compute if you use what's called Leibniz formula, because it's a combinatorial nightmare. You have to multiply basically every value of the matrix by every value of every row by every other row. It gets messy, but people thought of a nice trick to get around this called Gaussian elimination. So without just throwing the computer at it and trying to get the computer to learn to associate a matrix with its determinant, we came up with some very smart people came up with a nice algorithm that does it much faster. So I'd like to, say that there's still something to be said on the human side. All right. There's still other kinds of games, games in science, and they're kind of I like to break them down into citizen science games and therapeutic games. This first one I learned about recently was a mobile phone game called Janigma. And I won't show in the interest of time, I won't show the whole video, but you can look at their site down here. It was a game on people's phones, and it was meant to help you find new paths to treating cancer. Basically, they were trying to map out new cancer cells, map out the genome of cells. So yes, we have the genome, a human genome, it's all complete, but cancer cells have a mutated genome. And they wanted to find out what does that genome look like? And that's a tough challenge. And so let's skip that. But for example, in a cancer cell, there's rearrangements of the chromosomes. So for example, this purple chromosome is supposed to be its own chromosome, but in a cancer cell, it becomes linked to the red one. And there's a technique in molecular biology called chromosome capture, or Hi-C, which cross-links the chromosomes together and obtains reads like this. Reads where the part of the DNA came from one chromosome and another part of the DNA comes from another chromosome. And that shows up on these kind of plots, these Hi-C plots on the off diagonal. So in a normal cell, the red and the purple chromosome don't usually talk to each other, but in the cancer cell, they do because they're physically next to each other. And so this game had people representing the pieces of the chromosome as these different blocks. And their job was to put the puzzle together, to find the best solution to the puzzle, to line up those different fragments of DNA and say, what does the genome really look like? And the way they did it was that the computer had its own solution, and it had a predicted best way of doing it. But to get the actual perfect score, it would have to do a combinatorially complex task. It would have to do something it would have to evaluate a ton of different positions in order to fully solve it. And so only solve a 35-piece puzzle would take it, years, if not, eternities. But people could do it. People were able to beat the computer's score several times. They had lots of different submissions, and they were able to identify lots of different regions on the chromosome that were of interest. So this was a relatively recent experiment, and I was trying to find any more details about it, and I don't think they've even analyzed the data yet, but it's out there. Where else? There's also kind of different kind of class of game, which was games about cancer, and they had this game from a while ago called Remission. It was meant to have this cancer-fighting robot go shoot up the bad cells in the body. And the idea was, does this kind of game, encourage kids to take their medicine, right? Because getting kids to comply with these toxic drugs, might be difficult. And it's a little bit like the video games on behavior study. It makes a modest effect. It makes a small adjustment, but it's significant. So people who played this game called Remission instead of Indiana Jones, I think, were more likely to keep take their meds. They were more likely in different kinds of meds too. I mean, it's a small difference, and again, it's a little bit exaggerated because these graphs don't start at zero. But at the margin, maybe playing a game about cancer would make you want to stay on the medicine a little more. I'm running a little short of time, but there's other games out there too. This was more of a interactive movie than a game, but again, goes back to the emotional side of things. That games aren't just about shooting things up and killing and winning, but they're also about people's experience. So you can check out this clip if you like on YouTube called That Dragon Cancer. Okay, so we're in the last just few minutes here. I'd like to think about how do these things about video games really apply to your being a good scientist or just being excited about science. So the first part we talked about how games can kind of trick you into being good or at something, or trick you into liking something, or just engaging your inner self or your inner sense of motivation. And also how people can play games online on their phones to unconsciously further the cause of science. But I'd like to take a more active approach to think that these ideas that we use in video games, we can capture those 100 millions of hours that played on World of Warcraft and actually turn them into science, which is the ideal. So I've come up with 7 themes from video games that I think you can apply to your own life as a scientist. And the first one is the fetch quest. So in video games, you're often told to collect a lot of pieces of something and then come back and when you have all of them. So this is I think this applies in science a lot. And for example, you read a paper and there's tons of different references. It's a game. Find them all. See what they all mean. You track down the first one. Where does the chain of references go? Where's the chain of papers go? Also, collect the data. The data is something to collect. Make it a game. And there's hard to collect pieces of data, and there's easy to get data. So go for the big ones, right? And if you're more of a theoretical scientist, don't leave the gaps there. Don't leave anything hanging. Find all the pieces. It's like in a video game. You see the map being filled up as you go. And I think that's a good thinking of finding the data as a game will feed into your completionist instinct, which is I think tapped into a lot when we play video games. Another one, puzzle solving. You do this all the time in video games. Some very difficult ones, some that apparently don't even have a real solution. But I think the situation in a puzzle game is you're put into a situation with no rules. You don't have any clue what to do. The best example I think of is crosswords. You're given this blank slate and you're told to fill in the letters somehow. And you can do it. And without any instruction, you eventually get there. And I think this applies to any type of students in all disciplines, that just because you haven't seen something before doesn't mean that you can't figure it out. Like as I said before, it's very little genius, it's very much persistence. Fine. Okay, number 3, leveling up. So maybe you all played Pokemon when you were little, but leveling up, that's what we do. That's what you do in games. You don't start off saying I want to get to level 100. You start off saying I want to get to level 2. And this applies in all kinds of engineering or anytime you're building something. You're not trying to get to the complete state at the very beginning. You're trying to work in steps. And once you get to the next step, then you can contemplate the step after that. And again, the flip side of that is getting to one state, you should always want to improve on that state. I mean, the reason we get to level 20 is because now we can get to level 21. So work in steps. You can, then you'll see your progress go You'll marvel at your progress. Okay, another one, strategy guides. So you might recognize some of these. They don't really have too much of them anymore. Now you might just go on Google or our game FAQs to find out if you're stuck. But strategy guides are like the scientific papers of video game world. And when you read a strategy guide, you're not reading it to read it cover to cover, right? You're really reading it for some very specific piece of information, and that piece of information you'll read over and over and over again. So don't be daunted by the sheer amount of words in science. Most of it's garbage. Just read the ones that you're trying to read, the pieces that are important, and just read those, know those, and you'll have your own like embodiment of what the paper means. So that's because when I'm reading, when I'm trying to, if I need a strategy guide, I don't read about sections that I'm not interested in. I don't read about the boss I already beat. I read about the one I'm trying to beat. I can't get around. And I look at all the different people what they've all said about it in order to find the best way forward. Okay, we mentioned it, boss battles, right? So there's you and there's the giant Goliath trying to kill you, or you're trying to kill it. And boss battles in video games are, the hard battles. You almost always lose the first time you try. For example, this one. This one took me weekends. This one took me countless tries to do, and I finally did it. But it took a long, long time. And even if it takes you a long time to beat WeGraph, you approach it in steps. You have a strategy. You say, excuse me. You don't just try to you walk away. You say, I lost. What am I going to do to fix it? The same with like computer programming. It's very complicated, and you keep running into a problem. It's not working. So what do? You walk away. You come back with a strategy and how to tackle it differently. It works in all kinds of situations. Okay, we're almost out of time. But the theme 6 is the high score. High scores are a mainstay of video games. You play the game and you get 20,000 points. You're really good. But you look at the all-time record, it's 1,000,000 points. And you think it's impossible. How can I ever get there? And I think this is a very, this occurs a lot in science where people say something's impossible. And it's not a good way of thinking. For example, like you might recognize from quantum mechanics where the helium atom is famously has no solution under the quantum mechanical rules because of this interaction between the electrons. But this is not productive thinking to say that something has no solution. To be fair, he finds another way around it. But I remember during my grad school experience, I was facing a problem which I said maybe it has no solution, and I don't want to believe that. I still don't want to believe it. I don't want to go back there because there's a time of life I'd like to maybe move forward from. But you don't want to believe that your problem has no solution. It should be solvable, and then that will you can get to 1,000,000 points. It's possible. I'll skip that as for the interest of time, but just showing you that you can get the high scores. And finally, the game over, right? Everyone says game over every now and then, but as I said at the beginning, gaming, it's all pretend. It's a game. And you always can start again. You always get another chance. So don't be afraid of losing, especially in science. It's all experiments. Experiments, you're going to lose and you get another chance. So don't be discouraged. So that's to wrap it up. I just want to say science is all a game. It doesn't matter life is all a game. It's all we really know. It's so don't worry about it. Don't stress it. But at the same time, have fun with it. You might as well, do the best you can. And we celebrate when you can. Yeah. All right, that's all I have. Thank you all for listening. I'd like to thank Dean Quigley and the NYIT for letting me have this opportunity to talk about this stuff. For Yoshida Jezwal for making the beautiful posters you saw all over campus. Especially my parents for buying me a Game Boy Pocket when I turned 8 so that I could engage in this life of video games and science. And of course, to you for your attention. With whatever time left, I'll be happy to take any questions.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right.
Thank you.
Anyone want to? Oh, chat.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all for listening. And be sure, before you
Thank
sign
you.
off, be sure to join us again in a few weeks when Sophie Crispin will tell us about Robert Frost on his 150th birthday. So thank you, everyone. I'll see most of you next week. Bye.